He stood up in open court and called her embarrassing, said she was unstable. His mother nodded. His mistress smiled. The judge looked down at the file, then looked up with a completely different expression. Musa felt the room change before he even knew why. The morning came in slow and gray, the way mornings do when something heavy is already waiting for you. The Atlanta courthouse sat under a white sky, pigeons on the ledge, a flag barely moving in the October air. People moved up the steps in their coats and their quiet worries, and nobody paid attention to the woman who walked in alone, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying nothing but a small cloth bag. Her name was Shasa, and she had learned, a long time ago, how to walk through a room without asking it for anything. The courtroom filled up faster than she expected. Word travels in small communities. People who knew Musa, people who knew his mother Dora, people who had opinions they hadn't been asked for. They all found seats. The gallery hummed with low voices. Someone laughed near the back. A child was hushed. Shasa sat at the respondents' table and folded her hands and looked at the wood grain of the surface in front of her. She did not look around. She did not search for a friendly face. There was no friendly face to find. Musa came in like a man who had already won. His suit was charcoal gray, freshly pressed, and his attorney, a tall man named Curtis who wore his confidence like a second jacket, walked beside him with a thick folder tucked under one arm. Musa's jaw was set. His eyes were clear. He had rehearsed this. You could tell by the way he moved that he had stood in front of a mirror somewhere and practiced the posture of a man who had been wronged. His mother Dora settled into the front row of the gallery, like she was taking her regular pew at Sunday service. She was a wide woman with small eyes and large opinions, and she had never once in 12 years of marriage looked at Shasa with anything close to warmth. She straightened her church hat and crossed her arms and looked at the back of her son's head with the kind of pride that doesn't know when to stop. Behind Dora, 3 rows back, sat Renee. She wore white, not ivory, not cream, white. The kind of white a woman wears when she wants to make sure everyone in the room understands what she is claiming. She was composed and she was beautiful, and she watched Shasa with eyes that were flat and sure. She had won. She believed that completely. She sat like a woman waiting to receive something she had already been promised. Musa's attorney rose and addressed the court. He spoke smoothly, building the story the way a man builds a house he doesn't plan to live in, efficiently, without love. He said that his client had endured months of harassment from his estranged wife. He said that Shasa had followed Musa to restaurants, appeared uninvited at business functions, made repeated calls to his private phone late at night, and created an environment in which Musa's companion, he paused there, a careful word, had felt genuinely unsafe. He said the behavior was erratic. He said it was obsessive. He said it was the behavior of a woman who could not accept that a chapter of her life had closed. The gallery absorbed all of this. Heads tilted, eyes moved to Shasa. She did not respond. She sat with her hands folded and her gaze steady and her breathing slow, and she looked like a woman who had made peace with something a long time before this room ever asked her to. Judge Elwood was a man of 62 with silver at his temples, and reading glasses he wore low on his nose. He had presided over enough family court proceedings to know when a room was performing and when it was suffering, and he had learned to tell the difference by watching the person who said the least. He opened the case file that had been submitted to the court 48 hours prior. He turned the first page, then the second, then he stopped. He did not speak for a moment. He turned back to a page he had already passed. He read something again. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench and looked across the room. He looked at Musa. He looked at Shasa. He looked back at the file. Then he replaced his glasses, closed the folder with a careful hand, and said that both parties should return in 72 hours. He said there were matters he needed to review before proceeding. Musa's attorney frowned. That wasn't the ruling they had come for. Musa himself looked confused, just for a moment. A crack in the rehearsed face quickly smoothed back over. He turned to Curtis, and the two of them exchanged a low word. Dora unfolded her arms and refolded them and pressed her lips together. Renee in the gallery kept her smile, but it had shifted slightly. The way a smile shifts when the ground moves under it just a little. Shasa stood up from the table. She picked up her cloth bag. She smoothed the front of her dress with one hand, and she walked out of that courtroom the same way she had walked in, quietly, steadily, asking the room for nothing. The bracelet on her left wrist caught the overhead light as she pushed through the door. One flash of gold, and then she was gone. Nobody followed her. Nobody called her name. She walked down the courthouse steps alone, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, in the gray October air, and she breathed. She had been breathing like this for 12 years, long, deliberate breaths, the kind you learn when you grow up understanding that the world will not slow down to accommodate your pain, and so you have to carry it differently. You breathe it into something smaller, you fold it up, you keep going. She turned left and walked toward her car, and she did not look back at the courthouse, and she did not cry. Not yet. Not here. There is a place in rural Georgia, about 2 hours south of Atlanta, where the road turns to red clay and the trees grow close enough to touch the car on both sides, and the air smells like pine and something older than memory. That was where Shasa came from. Not from nothing, from something very specific, from a porch swing and a grandmother's hands and a voice that spoke in the kind of quiet that fills a room better than noise ever could. Her grandmother's name was Odette. Gran Odette, everyone called her, and she was the kind of woman who had built her entire life out of patience and precision and the absolute refusal to let the world define her on the world's terms. She raised vegetables in the back. She kept her Bible on the kitchen table, not the nightstand. She wore her hair natural and her back straight, and she never once raised her voice at anything that wasn't worth the breath. Shasa was 11 the first time Gran Odette pressed the bracelet into her palm. It was old leather, soft and dark from years of wear, with a small gold clasp and a word engraved on the inside of the band in letters so small you had to hold it close to read it. The word was enough. Gran Odette closed Shasa's fingers around it and held the child's hand between both of hers and looked at her the way adults look at children when they are trying to give them something that will take years to understand. She said, "Baby, the world will try to make you feel small. Don't fight it with noise. Fight it with what you build in the quiet." Shasa's mother had died when Shasa was 6. A car accident on a wet night. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could build a story around except the absence it left. Her father was a good man, a tired man, who worked 2 jobs and came home late and sometimes forgot to eat himself, let alone remember what his daughter needed. He loved her. He just didn't always know how to show up for love in the practical ways a child requires. So Shasa learned to show up for herself. She was reading financial newspapers at 13, not because anyone told her to, because numbers felt honest to her in a way that people sometimes didn't. Numbers didn't change their meaning based on who was in the room. Numbers didn't smile at you on Sunday and cut you on Monday. She understood that early, and she held on to it. She got a scholarship to study finance at a school in Virginia. No one drove her. No one stood on a porch and waved. She packed one bag, the same cloth bag she still carried, and she took a Greyhound bus north, and she pressed her face against the window and watched Georgia disappear behind her, and she kept her hand curled around the bracelet in her coat pocket, and she did not cry. She was going to build something. That was all she needed to know. College became graduate school. Graduate school became a position at a private equity firm in Charlotte. She was quiet in meetings and lethal in her analysis, and the partners noticed her even when they didn't say so. She was always the only black woman in the room. She got used to that the way you get used to cold water, not comfortably, but completely. She met Musa at 29 at a business conference where he was giving a small panel talk about growing a minority-owned construction company from the ground up. He was magnetic in the way certain men are magnetic, full of forward motion, full of easy charm, the kind of laugh that made a room lean toward him. Shasa sat in the third row and watched him and felt something unlock in her chest that she had kept closed for a long time. She told herself, "This is a man with ambition. This is someone building something." She didn't understand yet that some men's ambition is a beautiful performance and some men's ambition is an actual foundation, and that Musa's was the first kind, and that she would spend the next decade quietly laying the foundation he was taking credit for. They married after 2 years of dating. She wore ivory. He cried at the altar, and she believed every tear. Gran Odette, older by then and slower on her feet, sat in the front pew and touched the bracelet on Shasa's wrist as she passed and whispered, "Build slow, baby, build slow." In the first years of marriage, she helped him restructure his business model. She secured the initial loan, her name on the paperwork, her credit history, her relationships with the lenders. She negotiated his first major infrastructure contract. She handled the accounting, the projections, the quarterly reports. She did it all from a desk in their second bedroom with the door half open, while Musa hosted clients at dinner and shook hands and smiled his magnetic smile and let people believe he had done it all himself. She let him. She told herself it was partnership. She told herself she preferred the background. She told herself that the work was enough, that she didn't need the credit, that loving someone meant making them better even if they never thanked you for it. She was wearing the bracelet the whole time. Renee came into their lives on a Tuesday in March, introduced as a business development consultant who had contacts in commercial real estate. Musa mentioned her twice at dinner. The third time he mentioned her, Shasa counted 2 extra seconds before he said her name. A pause so small most people would miss it. Shasa was not most people. She said nothing. She watched. The late nights started gradually, which is how late nights always start. First once a week, then twice. Then the pattern of absence became the pattern of the house, and Shasa found herself sitting at that desk in the second bedroom, not doing company work anymore, but simply sitting, holding a cold cup of coffee, listening to the sound of a house that had too much room in it. Dora began coming around more. She had always made her feelings about Shasa clear through the particular cruelty of polite silence, the kind where you answer every question but never ask one, where you sit in someone's home and manage to make them feel like a guest in it. But now Dora arrived with a new energy, a brightness. She would sit at the kitchen table with Musa and speak in a low voice and stop when Shasa entered the room, and the silence that followed those conversations had a shape to it. Once Shasa passed the hallway outside the kitchen and heard Dora tell her son, "She's cold, Musa. She always been cold. Renee now, that woman knows how to be there for a man. That woman understands what you need." Shasa stood in the hallway and held very still. Then she walked back to the second bedroom and sat down at her desk and opened her laptop and pulled up the DeVoe Group Holdings portfolio summary and read every line of it until her heartbeat slowed. She had built DeVoe Group quietly over 7 years, in the margins of her marriage, in the hours before dawn and after midnight, using the knowledge she had cultivated since she was a girl, reading financial newspapers in rural Georgia. 14 companies, real estate, infrastructure, healthcare, $36 billion in assets under management. Nobody knew, not Musa, not Dora, not a single person at the dinner parties and business lunches and family gatherings where she had smiled and asked about people's children and refilled glasses and made herself invisible. She had learned from Gran Odette that some things you build in the quiet, that some power is not for showing, that the most important structures are the ones no one sees until they are already holding everything up. Gran Odette had not been a wealthy woman by any measure the world uses to count such things, but she had owned her land outright, had her name on every document, had never once asked a man to co-sign what was hers. That was the lesson underneath the lesson, not just to build, but to hold. To keep your name on the foundation even when the world would prefer you remain a decoration on someone else's. Shasa had taken that lesson and carried it through every room she had ever sat quietly in. She carried it through the graduate seminars where professors spoke over her head to men who understood less. She carried it through the early years in Charlotte, when colleagues borrowed her analysis and presented it as their own, and smiled at her afterward as if she should be flattered by the proximity to their credit. She carried it through every year of this marriage, every dinner party, every handshake where Musa accepted congratulations for things that would not exist without her hands on them. She had never stopped building, not for a single day, not even when the grief of being unseen had sat on her chest, so heavy she had to breathe around it. But something was changing now. She could feel it the way you feel weather, not from one sign, but from everything at once. The temperature of a room, the way a man looks past your face, the way his mother smiles at another woman's name. The night he sat her down, the television was on in the background, some game she wasn't watching. He sat across from her on the couch, and he put his hands on his knees, and he cleared his throat, and he told her he thought they needed a separation. He said it like he had decided on a restaurant, firmly, with finality, as if the discussion was a formality to be gotten through. He said they had grown apart. He said they wanted different things. He said he hoped they could be civil. He did not say Renee's name. He didn't have to. Shasa looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man who had cried at the altar, who had laughed in the kitchen, who had reached for her hand in theaters and airport lines and on slow Sunday mornings when the world was still. She looked at all of that, and she found, somewhere underneath the grief of it, something that surprised her. She found that she was ready. She said, "Okay," just that, one word. He blinked. He had expected tears, maybe shouting. He had braced for a scene. She saw the preparation on his face, the set jaw, the practiced firmness, and she saw it go unused. She gave him nothing to push against. She stood up and said she was going to bed, and she went. She lay in the dark for a long time, with the bracelet pressed between her fingers. She thought about Gran Odette. She thought about the bus ride north from Georgia all those years ago, and the way she had not cried, and the way the trees had disappeared behind her, and the way she had kept going. She had built things before from nothing. She knew how to do that. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in August, the process server came to the door. She saw the van from the upstairs window before she went down to open it. The neighbors on either side were in their driveways, one washing a car, one bringing in groceries. They watched without watching, the way neighbors do, with peripheral vision and full attention. The papers were thick. The restraining order application was formal and precise, full of careful language and specific dates, and a list of alleged behaviors so thorough you could tell a lawyer had spent real time building it. Renee was named in the filing as a victim. The woman Shasa's husband was sleeping with. The woman who had sat at Shasa's kitchen table and smiled with all her teeth was listed as a person requiring legal protection from Shasa. Shasa closed the front door. She walked to the kitchen table. She sat down. She read every page. She read it the way she read financial documents, slowly, completely, missing nothing. Then she set the papers down on the table beside her coffee cup. She picked up the bracelet from where it sat beside the sugar bowl and clasped it onto her wrist. She felt the small gold hardware click into place. She pressed her thumb against the word on the inside of the band that she did not need to read because she had memorized it long ago. She picked up her phone. She scrolled to a name she had not called in 2 years, her attorney, a woman named Gloria whose entire practice was built around people who had waited too long to move. She pressed call. When Gloria answered, Shasa said 4 words. "It is time now." Gloria said, "I'll have everything ready." The 72 hours passed, the way time passes when something inevitable is approaching, slowly on the outside, in full sprint underneath. Shasa ate her meals. She slept her hours. She sat at her desk in the second bedroom and she reviewed every document in the leather portfolio that Gloria had assembled, and she read each one twice and asked questions about the ones she needed to understand better, and by the time Thursday morning arrived, she was ready in the way that only preparation can make a person ready. Not excited, not nervous, just clear. She dressed simply, the same kind of dress she always wore. She was not performing. She had never needed to. The courtroom was fuller this time. The word had traveled, not just among people who knew Musa and Dora, but among others, people connected to the professional world of Atlanta's black business community, people who had heard fragments of the story and come to see how it resolved. The gallery was almost completely full. Voices were low. The air felt like the air before a verdict. Musa arrived with Curtis and Dora, and this time Dora had brought 2 women from her church who sat beside her like witnesses to a triumph. Renee was in the same seat she had taken 3 days earlier. She was wearing deep blue today, not white, but close enough. She sat with her ankles crossed and her bag in her lap, and the look of a woman who had been waiting patiently and was ready to collect. Shasa arrived 6 minutes before Judge Elwood took the bench. She walked in through the side door. She carried the leather portfolio this time instead of the cloth bag. She sat at the respondent's table and she placed the portfolio in front of her and she folded her hands on top of it. Musa looked at her. She did not look at him. Judge Elwood entered and the room stood and sat in the old, practiced rhythm of the court, and the judge settled into his chair and placed his reading glasses on his nose and opened the file that had been sitting on his desk for 72 hours with certain pages marked with small yellow tabs. He looked at Musa's attorney and he said, "Counselor, before you continue, I need to establish some context about the respondent." Curtis stood. He said, "Your Honor, with respect, we filed this petition on behalf of my client and his companion." The judge raised one hand, not unkindly, but completely. Curtis sat down. Judge Elwood looked at the first marked page. He spoke in the measured tone of a man who had learned that the most significant information deserves the most level delivery. He said, "The respondent in this matter, Shasa DeVoe Monroe, is the sole founder and controlling owner of DeVoe Group Holdings, a private equity firm currently managing assets totaling $36 billion. DeVoe Group holds controlling interest in 14 companies across the sectors of real estate, infrastructure, and healthcare." He paused. He let the number sit in the air of the room. 36 billion. It moved through the gallery like a current. Someone near the back made a sound. Someone near the front shifted in their seat. The judge continued. He said, "The petitioner's construction company, Musa Monroe Construction, LLC, is registered in the state of Georgia as a subsidiary entity under one of DeVoe Group's holdings. All primary lending instruments, credit line guarantees, and bonding agreements associated with Monroe Construction are underwritten through DeVoe Group affiliates. The respondent has served as silent guarantor on every major financial instrument the petitioner's company has operated under for the past 9 years." Curtis had stopped writing. His pen was still in his hand, but the hand had forgotten what it was doing. Musa sat very still. The rehearsed posture was gone. The set jaw was gone. He was sitting the way people sit when the ground has shifted and the body hasn't received the instruction to react yet. Just still, just waiting for a message that hadn't arrived. Dora had uncrossed her arms. Her church hat was slightly tilted because she had turned her head too fast. The women beside her from the congregation were looking at each other, and then at her, and then at the front of the room. Judge Elwood turned to a second marked page. He said, "Additionally, the filing names one Renee Burgess as a companion of the petitioner and as a victim of the respondent's alleged harassment. The court notes that Ms. Burgess has been under contract as a strategic communications consultant to a DeVoe Group subsidiary for the past 8 months. Her consultancy invoices show payment of $4,000 per month from that subsidiary." Renee's face changed. It was subtle, the way a portrait changes when the light shifts. But it changed. The gallery was no longer making any sound at all. Shasa unfolded her hands. She opened the leather portfolio. She removed one document, a single sheet, crisp, clean, and she placed it in front of Gloria, who had appeared at her side and who walked it to the bench with the ease of a woman who had done this before and knew exactly what she was delivering. Shasa spoke for the first time in this courtroom. Her voice was low and steady and did not rush toward anything. She said, "Your Honor, I have no interest in contesting the restraining order. I ask only that the court receive this notice." Judge Elwood looked at the document. He nodded once. The document was a notice of dissolution of all financial instruments, guarantees, lending relationships, and subsidiary designations connecting DeVoe Group Holdings to any entity bearing the name Musa Monroe. Effective immediately, filed that morning at 7:47 a.m. Curtis turned to Musa. His mouth was open but producing nothing. Musa turned to look at Shasa, fully, for the first time since she had sat down. He looked at her the way people look at something they have always taken for granted when they finally understand what it was. Too late, completely, with a horror that has nowhere to go. Shasa was already standing. She straightened the front of her dress with one slow, flat hand. She picked up the leather portfolio. She looked at Musa, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting to win. She looked at him the way you look at something you chose to put down, calmly, completely, without regret and without return. She held that look for 3 seconds. Then she turned. She walked toward the door. The gallery parted in her attention, every eye tracking her movement, every voice still. The bracelet on her left wrist caught the courtroom light as she reached the door. One clean flash of gold. Then the door closed behind her, and the room stayed silent for a long time after. The first call came to Curtis at 9 that evening. It was from the primary lender on Monroe Construction's largest active contract, a $47 million infrastructure project outside Savannah. The lender said the guarantee instrument had been withdrawn effective that morning. The project credit line was suspended pending new backing. The project was frozen. Curtis called Musa. Musa called 2 other lenders. The conversations were all the same. The backing was gone. The name on the paperwork was his, but the name behind the paperwork, the name nobody had known to look for, was hers. And now she had stepped aside, quietly, with 1 document and 7 words to a judge, and everything built on her silence was standing in open air. By the end of the following week, 3 major contracts had issued suspension notices. The office building in Buckhead where Monroe Construction operated, leased through a property management company that turned out to be a DeVoe Group subsidiary, sent a non-renewal notice that gave 30 days. The company bookkeeper, trying to reconcile the accounts, discovered that the company's operating software, its project management platform, and its industry liability insurance were all provided through vendors ultimately connected to the same network. Every thread pulled from the same source. Musa drove to the house on a Saturday morning. He sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before he got out of the car. He walked to the front door and rang the bell. He knocked. He stood on the porch and looked at the windows and said her name once, into the quiet neighborhood air, and the word went nowhere. He used his key. The key still worked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was clean. It was immaculate, in fact, cleaner than it had ever been when she was living in it, which was already clean. Every surface was clear. Every room was empty of the particular presence of a person. The closets in the master bedroom held his clothes on one side and nothing on the other, just the bar and the empty hangers, swaying slightly in the air movement of the opened door. He walked to the kitchen. He stood at the table where he had sat her down and told her about the separation in the careful voice of a rehearsed man. He looked at the counter. There was one thing on the counter, a photograph in a simple frame, their wedding day. He was at the altar, crying. She was walking toward him in her ivory dress. She was smiling, but if you knew how to look at Shasa, if you had ever really learned how to look at her, you could see in that smile the thing he had always mistaken for restraint. It wasn't restraint, it was depth. It was the expression of a woman who understood exactly what she was walking into and had decided to walk in anyway, out of love, because she had believed in the possibility of him. The photograph was face down. He turned it over. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned it back over and looked at the back. One word in her handwriting, small, even letters, the same word she had read on a bracelet as a child, the same word she had worn against her skin every day of her adult life, the word she had pressed against her thumb in the dark when the grief was too large and the world was too loud. Enough. He set the photograph down. He sat in the kitchen chair, her chair, the one she had always chosen, the one by the window, and he sat there in the silence of the house he had emptied of the most important thing in it, and he had nothing to do with his hands. Dora called him 3 times that day. He didn't answer. He was beginning to understand. In the slow and terrible way understanding arrives when it is too late, that his mother's certainty had been a kind of blindness, dressed as wisdom, and that he had mistaken her confidence for clarity his entire life. Renee sent 3 texts, then 2 more, then a voice message that started calmly and ended with a different energy. The consulting contract had ended. The income she had counted on was gone. She had been paid from the same woman's accounts she had smiled at in that courtroom. She had sat in that gallery in her white dress and smiled at the woman who had been signing her checks. When she understood that, she called Musa one final time. The call lasted 42 seconds. After that, her number went to a new voicemail message that did not mention him. The women from Dora's church stopped coming around. Dora sat in her house on Briarwood and looked at her television and said very little for a very long time. She was a woman who had raised her son to believe he was always the most important person in any room, and she was beginning to understand the particular cost of that kind of love, that it does not prepare a person for a world in which someone else has already decided the terms. And Musa drove around Atlanta for days. He drove the familiar routes, past the office, past the project sites, past the restaurants where he had taken Renee, past the courthouse on the gray street where he had stood up and called his wife embarrassing. He drove, and he thought, and he tried to find the moment where things had turned, and he kept arriving at the same place, a woman at a respondent's table with her hands folded and her eyes down, and a bracelet on her wrist that he had never once asked her about. He thought about all the things he had never asked her. He had never asked about her childhood. He had never asked what she wanted to build for herself, separate from what they were building together. He had never asked what she was afraid of, what she dreamed about, what kept her up on the nights he wasn't home. He had never asked about the bracelet, that worn leather band she touched when she thought no one was looking, that she pressed between her fingers in the dark of the bedroom when she thought he was asleep. He had slept beside that woman for 12 years, and he had never once asked her what that word meant. He had never thought to wonder. He pulled over on a side street near Piedmont Park and sat with the engine running. A man on the sidewalk walked past with a dog. Two women jogged by in the gray morning cold. The city kept moving the way cities do, indifferent to the stillness of one man in a parked car, finally understanding the weight of what he had held and let go. He had called her embarrassing in open court. He had sat across from her with a lawyer and his mother and the woman he was sleeping with, and he had built a case out of language and paper and the practiced confidence of a man who had never once been asked to account for himself. Not by his mother, not by his colleagues, not by the world that had always made just enough room for him to believe he was the most important person moving through it. And she had sat across from him and folded her hands and looked at the table and said nothing. And he had read that silence as defeat. He had looked at her every day for 12 years. He had never seen her. 6 months passed. The world turned the way it does, indifferent to the stories inside it, keeping its own time. There is a town on the Georgia coast where the marsh grass goes silver in the winter light, and the mornings are wide and quiet, and the water moves in long, slow rhythms that have nothing to do with urgency. Shasa had bought a house there 5 years earlier through a DeVoe Group subsidiary, and she had never told anyone about it. She had visited it twice a year, alone, in the way people visit the version of their life they are building toward, not living there yet, but keeping it ready. She was living there now. The porch was wide and faced the water, and in the morning she brought her coffee out and sat in the chair that faced east and watched the light change over the marsh. The bracelet was on her wrist. It was always on her wrist. She did not think of Musa the way she had expected to think of him. She had anticipated a grief that would fill the mornings, the kind of loss that announces itself at dawn because the day hasn't built its defenses yet. But what she found instead was a quietness that was not emptiness, a space that was not absence. She was building again. She had always been building. The DeVoe Group offices in Atlanta operated the way they always had, efficiently, precisely, with a team of 12 people who understood that their director's silence was not distance, but focus. 3 of those 12 were young black women, fresh from graduate programs who Shasa had recruited personally, who she had seen something of herself in, who she was teaching the way Gran Odette had taught her, not with speeches but with presence, with the daily example of a woman who worked without noise and built without asking permission. She had them over to the coastal house one weekend, that January. They sat on the wide porch in the cold, and she made food, and they talked about the work and about the world, and about what it meant to build something that was yours in every real sense of the word. One of the young women asked her once what she was afraid of. She thought about it for a long time before she answered. She said, "I used to be afraid of being too much for people to hold. And then I learned that that is not my problem to manage." She touched the bracelet when she said it. The young woman watched her hand and didn't ask about it. Some things are understood without questions. Another one of the young women, the youngest one, the one who reminded Shasa most of her own early self, the one who was always the last to leave a meeting and the first to arrive, asked her something else before they left that evening. She asked, "How did you know when it was time to move?" Shasa looked at the water for a moment. The marsh was going silver in the fading light. The question was a real one, and it deserved a real answer. She said, "When staying started costing more than I was willing to pay, when I realized that my silence had become their permission, that's when I knew." The young woman wrote that down in the small notebook she always carried. Shasa watched her write it and felt something move through her that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but sat somewhere between the two. The particular feeling of a lesson that cost something finally becoming useful to someone else. At the end of that visit, after the young women had driven back to Atlanta, Shasa sat alone on the porch, in the dark with her coffee going cold in her hands, and the marsh moving in its slow silver way under the winter stars. She thought about Gran Odette. She thought about the porch swing in Georgia and the old leather pressing into her young palm and the voice that had given her the only thing she had ever really needed. Not money, not strategy, not the tools of the world, though she had gathered all of those. Just the knowledge that who she was already before the world had done anything to her or for her was enough. She thought. She knew. That old woman knew. She had given Shasa the only tool that actually matters. Not a strategy, not a formula, not a set of rules for navigating a world that was not built with her in mind. She had given her a word, one word carved in gold, worn against the skin. The kind of word that means something different every time the world tries to take something from you. The kind of word that grows with you, that waits for you on the other side of every hard season and reminds you you were never as small as they needed you to be. She put the coffee cup down. She pressed her thumb to the inside of the bracelet band in the dark, feeling the small letters without needing to see them. She sat there for a while with the sound of the water and the stars and the silence that was not empty but full, and she smiled. Just slightly. The way people smile when they have arrived somewhere, they always knew they were going. She never needed to be loud. She never needed to fight. She just needed to be exactly who she always was, and let the truth do the rest. The quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous, not because they want to destroy you, but because they have already decided you don't have the power to. If this woman's story moved something in you, if you have ever stayed quiet while people underestimated you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Stay strong and stay blessed. I will see you in the next one.